The blood hit the floor before anyone knew what was happening. 1 second, the man was standing in the doorway of the Copper Kettle Diner, hand pressed hard against his left shoulder, face the color of old ash. The next second, he crashed sideways through the glass pastry case, sending shards and ceramic plates skidding across the linoleum. A woman at the counter screamed. A teenage busboy dropped his tray. The night cook leaned out from the kitchen window, saw the spreading dark stain, and disappeared back behind the partition without a word. 31-year-old ER nurse Mara Voss was the only one who moved toward him. She was still in her scrubs, still had the paper bracelet from Harlow Regional Medical Center's staff break room around her left wrist. She'd been at that diner for 19 minutes, long enough to order the turkey melt she hadn't touched, short enough that her coffee was still hot. She crossed the floor in 4 steps, dropped to her knees in the glass, and drove her right hand into the wound before the man's body finished settling. No gloves, no kit, no hesitation. She could feel the blood pumping hard against her palm, too fast, too rhythmic, the unmistakable pulse of a lacerated artery. A severed subclavian, maybe. Whatever it was, he had maybe 90 seconds before the pressure dropped too far to recover. "Someone call 911, she said. Not loud, not panicked. The same flat, functional tone she used when a trauma bay went sideways at 3 in the morning. "And I need a belt. Leather, not fabric. Now." Nobody moved for a full 3 seconds. "Now," she said again, and something in her voice cut through the shock like a blade through gauze. 2 people reached for their belts at the same time. If you've made it this far, stay with me. This story goes somewhere you are not expecting. Like this video, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Scene. The man's name she didn't know yet. What she knew was that he was approximately 6 feet, built lean, but dense, the way people get when muscle is functional rather than decorative. Late 30s, maybe 40. The shoulder wound was entry only. Whatever made it went in clean and didn't come out. His breathing was shallow, but not ragged. He was conscious, barely, and he was looking at her with eyes that weren't afraid. That was the part that struck her. Most people in that much pain were somewhere between terrified and absent. This man was watching her the way you watch someone you're deciding whether to trust. "You're going to be okay," she told him, because that's what you told people. Then she leaned down slightly and said something only he could hear. "Stop tensing the shoulder. You're making it worse." His expression shifted, the faintest recalibration. He stopped tensing. She got the belt threaded and positioned, cinched it hard at the base of his neck and shoulder junction in a configuration that had no name in any standard first aid manual she'd ever seen cited in a civilian training. It worked because of geometry, not because of medical school. The bleeding slowed to a seep. She sat back on her heels, both hands covered to the wrist, and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The sirens were already close. Behind her, someone was still crying quietly. The busboy had come back out and was staring at her hands. The woman at the counter had her phone up, filming, because of course she did. Mara didn't look at the camera. She just kept her fingers on the pulse point at the man's neck and counted. 42 beats per minute, low but holding. The paramedics came through the door 90 seconds later. She briefed them in 10 words. Approximate vessel location, improvised compression method, current vitals. The lead paramedic, a young guy, probably 6 months out of school, looked at the belt configuration, looked at her, and started to ask something. "Just don't move it until he's in a bay," she said, and stood up. She was reaching for a napkin to wipe her hands when the second paramedic said, quietly, "That's not a standard compression." "No," she agreed. "It's not." She left the diner through the side door before the first police cruiser finished parking. She didn't make it far. Mara lived 7 blocks from the Copper Kettle, in a second-floor apartment above a dry cleaner that smelled permanently of chemical heat. She was halfway up the exterior stairs, keys in hand, when the patrol unit pulled up to the curb. "Ma'am." The officer who climbed out wasn't unfriendly, but he wasn't soft either. Late 30s, buzz cut, the particular flatness behind the eyes of someone who'd learned not to read situations too early. "You were at the Copper Kettle tonight?" "I was." "We need you to come with us." She looked at her hands, still faintly stained despite the napkins. I need to clean up first. We'd prefer you come now. She studied him for a moment. The cruiser behind him had a second officer who'd stayed in the vehicle. Door cracked slightly. Listening, not involved. The streetlight caught the edge of something on the second officer's collar that wasn't standard Dawson County Sheriff's Department insignia. All right, she said. She came down the stairs and got in the back of the cruiser without being asked. The police station in Harlow, Montana, occupied a brick building on the corner of Sutter and 4th that had been a hardware store before the county bought it in 1987. The processing area still had the original wood floor, and the interview rooms in back smelled like pine cleaner and stale coffee. Mara sat across a bolted-down table from two men who were not Dawson County deputies. She'd known that the moment she saw them. The suits were wrong. Not expensive, just uniform in a way that local law enforcement never quite managed. The man on the left, maybe 50, had the kind of haircut that comes from a military installation's on-base barber. He hadn't introduced himself yet. The one on the right was younger, mid-30s, and he had a yellow legal pad in front of him with nothing written on it. Ms. Voss, the older one said, I'm Special Agent Dorian Hatch, FBI. This is Agent Krell. We appreciate your cooperation. She said nothing. The man you assisted tonight, Hatch continued, is not a civilian. His name is Garrett Novak. He paused. He works for the federal government in a capacity I'm not going to elaborate on tonight. What I can tell you is that he was being targeted, professionally. And you're wondering how a hospital nurse knew what to do with a subclavian bleed, Mara said. Hatch's expression didn't change. Among other things, the younger agent, Krell, clicked his pen. The paramedic on scene described your intervention as, he glanced at something on the legal pad, outside of anything in the civilian trauma protocol. His words. He's right, Mara said. So where did you learn it? She looked at the legal pad, then at Krell, then at Hatch. I've been a nurse for 6 years. Before that, I was in the military. Which branch? Army. MOS? She met his eyes and said nothing. Hatch leaned forward slightly. Ms. Voss, a federal asset was nearly killed tonight in your jurisdiction. We need to understand the full picture of what happened in that diner. I already told the responding officer. The man came in through the door. He collapsed. I intervened. I waited for EMS. I went home. That's the full picture. With a compression technique that isn't in any civilian manual. I improvised. Krell made a small sound. Not quite a laugh. You improvised a battlefield arterial compression in a diner in under 30 seconds. The alternative was watching him die. She said it simply, without emphasis. Was there a question in there? The room was quiet for a moment. Hatch sat back. He studied her the way she'd studied the man on the diner floor, trying to make a decision. Where were you stationed? That's not relevant to your investigation. Ms. Voss, I helped a man who was bleeding. I'm not the one you should be talking to. She kept her voice even. Are you detaining me? Silence. Then I'd like to go home. Hatch didn't move immediately. Then he stood, picked up the folder in front of him and said, We'll need you available for follow-up. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I have a shift at 7. Go. They drove her home themselves, which told her several things. She was being watched, at minimum. The federal interest in Garrett Novak, whoever he actually was, ran deep enough that 2 FBI agents were sitting in a county sheriff's interview room at midnight instead of running this through local channels. And they'd pulled her name from the scene fast, which meant they either had a rapid response unit working the area already, or they'd been tracking Novak's movement and had surveillance on the copper kettle before the incident. Neither option was comforting. She let herself into the apartment, washed her hands twice, and stood at the kitchen window with a glass of water she didn't drink. The cruiser was still at the curb. She counted to 60, and it pulled away. She went to the closet in the hallway, past the coats, past the box of books she'd never unpacked, and pulled a flat case from behind the water heater. She opened it on the kitchen table. Inside, a SAT phone still charged. A folded piece of paper she never read anymore. A small photo she also didn't look at. and beneath those, a worn field identification card with her picture on it. Younger, no expression, hair pulled back sharp, and a name that was technically still hers, printed under a unit designation that had never appeared in any press release or congressional report. She stared at the card for a moment. Then she closed the case and put it back. She'd chosen Harlow for its smallness, for the way the mountains to the west absorbed noise and the winters kept people inside and minding their own business, for the hospital that needed nurses badly enough not to ask too many questions about the gaps in her work history, for the particular anonymity of a place where everyone knew your name but nobody needed to know your story. She'd been here 2 years. She'd built something quiet, something that worked. She sat down on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinets, because sometimes a bed was too much distance to manage, and she looked at the ceiling and listened to the building settle in the cold. The man in the diner hadn't been scared. That kept coming back. She'd seen a lot of people get hurt. On the job, before the job, in the years she didn't talk about. People reacted to pain and mortal threat in predictable ways. They went inward, or they panicked, or they disassociated. The ones who'd been through serious training could hold a face together, but there was always something behind the eyes that shifted. Garrett Novak had looked at her like he was cataloging her. She fell asleep on the kitchen floor sometime after 2. Old habit. The floor was fine. Her shift at Harlow Regional started at 7, and she was there at 6:45 because she was always there early. The hospital was small by any standard. 4 floors, 82 beds, a trauma bay that handled the worst the county could produce and transferred the rest to the bigger center in Billings. The ER was competent and perpetually understaffed, which was why Mara had settled into a schedule that was technically part-time and practically full-time by the second month. She was 2 hours into a normal morning, a ranch hand with a hand laceration, a kid with a respiratory thing, a woman in her 60s who'd had chest pain that turned out to be musculoskeletal when the attending, Dr. Paul Radner, found her at the supply station. Radner was 58 and had been the ER attending at Harlow Regional for 11 years. He was a good doctor and a middling manager, and he had a habit of delivering bad news while looking at something other than the person he was talking to. He was looking at the supply inventory sheet when he said, "Mara, you want to tell me what happened last night?" She turned to look at him. "I helped someone who was hurt. The FBI called the administrator's office this morning." She waited. They were... He paused, still not looking at her. "They had questions about your background, your previous employment history." Another pause. "The administrator is going to want to talk to you." "About what specifically?" He finally looked up. Paul Radner was not a man who was easily made uncomfortable, but he looked uncomfortable now. "Your record shows a 3-year gap before you started here, and your military discharge documentation has some irregularities. I don't know the details. I'm just telling you what I was told." "And?" "And Linda Hosh is going to ask you to take administrative leave while HR reviews the situation." Linda Hosh was the hospital administrator. Mara had spoken to her 4 times in 2 years, all of it operational and none of it personal. She was not someone Mara had a strong read on. "I see," Mara said. "I'm sorry," Radner said, and he meant it. I don't have the full picture." "No one does," she said. She put down the inventory clipboard and went to find Linda Hosh. The administrator's office was on the 3rd floor, past the patient services wing, in a corner with a view of the hospital parking lot, and beyond it, the industrial edge of Harlow's Eastern District. Linda Hosh was 60, trim, with the particular competence-exhaustion combination of someone who'd run a small hospital for a long time and knew that every day was a new argument with someone. She was not unkind. Mara had always given her that. "Sit down," she said. Mara sat. "I'll be direct." Hosh folded her hands on the desk. "The FBI contacted our administration this morning with questions about your credentialing, specifically about a 3-year period in your employment history that your application listed as military service, but which doesn't appear in the verification records they pulled." "The military records exist," Mara said. "They're just restricted." "Restricted?" "Yes." Hosh studied her. "Mara, I need to understand who I have working in my ER. If there are questions about your background, my nursing license is current. My certifications are current. My clinical record here speaks for itself. That's not the issue. Then what is? Hosh's jaw tightened slightly. The issue is that I have federal agents telling me that a nurse in my ER may have a background she didn't disclose, and I don't know what that means for this hospital's liability or for patient safety. My background has never been a risk to a patient. I'm not saying it has. I'm saying I don't know enough to make that determination, and until I do, I need you to take administrative leave. The word sat in the air. Leave. Another one. She'd had leaves before. The kind that came with clean paperwork and no explanations and a date that kept moving. Mara looked at the parking lot through the window for a moment. A pickup truck was pulling into a visitor space with its tailgate down. A woman was helping an older man out of the passenger side. How long? She said. I don't know. HR needs to contact the credentialing board and we'll go from there. Fine. She stood. I need to finish the handoff notes on my current patients before I go. Of course. Take the morning. Mara nodded once and left. She spent the next hour writing the cleanest, most thorough nursing notes she'd written in a year. Every patient, every detail, every consideration flagged for the incoming shift. She did it because she was professional and because some part of her was aware this might be the last time she wrote notes in that building. She was at the nurses' station when the call came in. Not a call to her, specifically, a call to the ER desk. The charge nurse, a woman named Dell, who'd been at Harlow Regional for 20 years and who had the unflappable steadiness of someone who'd seen everything twice, picked up the receiver and her face changed, in the particular way faces change when the information doesn't make immediate sense. She hung up and looked across the station at Mara. Garrett Novak was transferred here from County General in Billings this morning, Dell said slowly. They brought him in about 40 minutes ago. ICU. Mara went very still. Why would they transfer him here? Dell said. We don't have the surgical capacity that... Because someone thought this hospital was safer, Mara said, and she already knew it wasn't, and she was already moving toward the supply cabinet for the one thing she'd need. Mara, you're on administrative leave. I know. She found what she was looking for. Which means I'm not here in an official capacity. She looked at Dell. Don't put me in the system. Dell stared at her. I need you to trust me, Mara said. Right now. Do you trust me? Dell was quiet for 2 full seconds. Then, room 412. The ICU at Harlow Regional occupied most of the 4th floor's east wing. It had 8 bays, a nurse's station at the midpoint, and a single elevator that opened onto a secured corridor with a keypad entry Mara still had the code for from her last rotation. She took the stairs. She moved through the hospital the way she always moved through it, purposeful, unremarkable, the specific invisibility of someone who belongs. Nobody stopped her. Nobody looked twice. She had scrubs on and a lanyard that was slightly wrong for the current rotation but wouldn't survive close inspection. She didn't need it to. The 4th floor corridor was wrong before she got through the stairwell door. She could feel it the way you feel temperature change. Not something you think, something your body registers first. It was too quiet. There should have been voices from the nursing station. The low electronic hum of monitoring equipment was there, but the ambient noise of a working floor, the small human sounds that accumulated into something you learned to read without being aware of it, was absent. She pushed through the door slowly. The nurse's station at the midpoint of the corridor was empty. Not on break empty. Not stepped away empty. Abandoned. A paper cup of coffee was tipped on its side, liquid spreading slowly across the counter. A chart was open on the desk, half finished. She turned left toward room 412. 14 feet from the door, she stopped. The first man was on the floor in the alcove beside the linen cart. He was in the blue uniform of a hospital security contractor. The federal detail Hatch's team had obviously arranged. And he was on his side with his hands open and relaxed, which was wrong. People who were unconscious from trauma didn't relax. They went loose in a different way, with a different geometry. He'd been rendered, quickly, professionally. She did not check his pulse. She noted his chest moving. She She moved the remaining distance to room 412 and looked through the narrow window panel in the door. Inside, Garrett Novak, unconscious and connected to two monitors. And beside him, in blue scrubs that were wrong, the shade was wrong, a half-degree too dark for Harlow Regional's standard issue. A person in gloves who was holding a syringe and locating the IV line with the efficient, focused motion of someone who had done this before. Not a nurse. Not even close. Mara looked at the door handle, looked at the syringe, looked at the distance between the person's thumb and the injection port. She opened the door. She didn't announce herself, didn't say stop or freeze, or any of the things that gave people a half-second to react. She crossed the room in 3 steps and got her left hand around the wrist holding the syringe before the person's thumb completed its downward press. The needle skated sideways off the IV port and went into the air. Mara twisted hard. Not a nurse's motion, not anything from a civilian training, and the syringe hit the floor. The person in the wrong shade scrub spun and shoved her back with surprising force, one hand into her sternum, and Mara hit the wall-mounted supply cabinet hard enough to rattle the contents. She caught herself on the edge of the bed frame. Up close, she could see the details. Male, late 30s, broad through the shoulders in a way that wasn't administrative. The gloves were nitrile, but the hands inside them were the wrong shape for a medical worker. Knuckles that had been broken and reset, a scar line along the right thumb web that ran too straight to be accidental. He came at her fast and without noise, which was professional, and he went for her throat first, which told her something about his training. She dropped her chin and took the forearm across the collarbone instead of the neck, felt the impact all the way to her back molars, and used the momentum to redirect him into Novak's IV stand. The stand went sideways. 2 of the monitor leads pulled free, and the machine began its flat, insistent alarm tone. The man recovered faster than she expected. He had a backup. Not a syringe this time, a folding blade that was already open. She didn't see where it came from, and he moved with it in a tight, controlled arc that said he'd trained with it specifically, not just carried it. She put the visitor chair between them, bought herself 2 seconds. 2 seconds was enough to read him, the way he weighted his front foot, the slight cant of his shoulder when he fainted. She'd been in rooms with people like this before. Not many, but enough. The specific calibration of someone who was dangerous and knew it and let that knowledge make them slightly lazy. He lunged. She let him get close enough that the blade committed, then stepped inside the arc and drove her elbow up under his chin. His teeth clacked together. She grabbed his knife wrist with both hands, turned it against the joint until something gave with a sound like a green branch snapping, and the blade dropped. He was still standing. She hit him twice more, once in the floating rib, once at the hinge of his jaw, and he went down against the wall and stayed there, breathing, not unconscious, but done. The monitor was still alarming. Mara picked up the syringe from the floor, capped it with a lens cap from the supply cabinet, and stepped back to check Novak's IV line. The port was intact. The needle hadn't depressed. Whatever was in the syringe hadn't gone in. She stood there for a moment with both hands on the bed rail, breathing through her nose. The man on the floor said thickly, "You broke my wrist." "Yes?" she said. Footsteps in the corridor, running. The door opened and 2 people came through nearly simultaneously. A Harlow County deputy she didn't recognize, and behind him, Agent Krell from the night before, jacket open, hand on a holster he hadn't drawn from yet. They both stopped when they saw the man on the floor and then looked at Mara. Krell's expression went through 4 things in rapid succession. She watched him work through them. "The syringe," she said, and held it out toward him. "You'll want that. And there's a security officer down in the alcove by the linen cart. He's alive, but he needs to be assessed." Krell stared at her. "Also, someone should reattach leads 2 and 4 before the patient's chart throws a cardiac flag." The deputy looked at Krell. Krell looked at the man on the floor who was holding his wrist against his chest and staring at the ceiling with the vacant focus of someone managing significant pain. "How did you know to come up here?" Krell said. "Dell told me he'd been transferred." She set the syringe on the supply cabinet, carefully. "I came to check on him." "You're on administrative leave." "I'm aware. I wasn't here as a nurse." She looked at Novak, still unconscious, chest rising and falling steadily. "How many people do you have on this floor right now?" 2 officers outside the east stairwell, and 1 at the elevator, Krell stopped. How many did you have an hour ago? His jaw tightened. 4. You're down to 2 if the one in the alcove is still out. She moved toward the door. This building has a west stairwell that doesn't connect to the main corridor. It exits to the loading dock. If he wasn't working alone, that's your next problem. Wait. Crowley caught her arm, not hard, more reflex than intention. You can't. You need to stay here and give a statement. She looked at his hand on her arm. He let go. Get your people down to the loading dock, she said. I'll be at the nurse's station. She wasn't, of course. She was already moving toward the west stairwell. The loading dock was empty when she got there, which was either good news or the worst kind of news, and she wasn't sure which yet. The dock door was ajar. Not open, just ajar. A 2-inch gap that let in a blade of cold Montana morning air. Someone had come through. Someone might still be close. She stood in the doorway and looked at the parking area behind the hospital. A panel van, white, no markings, idling at the far edge of the lot near the drainage fence. She couldn't see the plate from here. She could see the exhaust vapor, and she could see that the driver's window was cracked despite the cold. Watching. She pulled back into the dock and pressed her back against the interior wall. Thought for a moment about what she had, which was nothing. No phone, she'd left it in her locker. No radio, no badge that currently meant anything. The folding knife she'd disarmed from the man upstairs was still in her pocket because she'd picked it up without thinking and hadn't thought about it since. She left it there. The van didn't move for another minute. Then it did. Not fast, not conspicuous, just a slow pull away from the fence line and out toward the service road that ran along the hospital's south perimeter. She memorized the plate as it turned. Montana registration, partial. She got 4 of the 6 characters before the angle changed. She went back inside. By the time she reached the 4th floor again, there were 3 more county deputies in the corridor, and Agent Hatch had arrived in a coat that wasn't suited for Montana in March, which told her he'd driven here from somewhere that wasn't expecting to be cold. He was standing outside 412 with a phone to his ear and a look on his face that wasn't quite anger. Something more contained, with more structural damage beneath it. He saw her and ended the call. Ms. Voss, he said. The van, she said, and gave him the partial plate and the direction it had taken on the service road. White, no markings, panel style, late model. Driver was watching the dock from the parking lot. He stared at her for a moment. Then he repeated what she'd said into his phone without looking away from her, and she could tell from the way he said it that he was talking to someone who was already running it. Come with me, he said. They used a conference room on the 2nd floor. Small, no windows, a folding table, and 4 chairs that didn't match. Hatch sat across from her. Krell stood near the door with a notepad. Neither of them had brought coffee, which under different circumstances she might have found annoying. Walk me through it, Hatch said. She did. Clear, sequential, no editorializing. She described the floor, the nurse's station, the man in the wrong scrubs, the sequence of the physical confrontation, the syringe, the van. She said it the way she wrote nursing notes, functional, precise, with no language that was doing anything other than conveying information. When she finished, Hatch was quiet for a moment. The security officer in the alcove, he said. You walked past him. He was breathing, and I had maybe 10 seconds before the syringe was in the line. How did you know 10 seconds? I didn't. I estimated. Crowley shifted his weight. And the physical confrontation? I've already described it. He was a trained individual, Crowley said carefully. Significantly larger than you. Yes. And you? I've described it, she said again. If there's a specific question, ask it. Hatch leaned forward slightly. He had the particular patience of someone who'd learned to use silence as a tool, and he deployed it now, letting it stretch, watching her sit in it. She'd learned in a different context that the way to handle institutional silence was to be more comfortable in it than the person using it. She waited. Your military record, he said finally. The version we can access says you served 4 years, medical support, honorable discharge. No combat deployment, no specialized training. He paused. That's clearly not the full picture. No, she agreed. It's not. We need the full picture. Talk to the Department of the Army, she said. They'll tell you exactly as much as they're authorized to tell you. We have. He held her gaze. The people we reached either don't have the clearance to access your file or they're being told to redirect us. Something moved across her face that she didn't quite suppress. Not surprise. She'd expected them to try. Something more like confirmation of a calculation she'd been running since the night before. Then you understand, she said, that there's a limit to what I can tell you in a room like this. Hatch looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat back and rubbed one hand across his jaw, and that was the first gesture she'd seen from him that wasn't fully managed. The man you put down upstairs, he said. He's not going to tell us anything useful. He went through the federal system in about 40 minutes. No prints on record, ID that dead ends at a shell incorporation in Delaware. Whoever sent him knew how to build a ghost. They usually do, she said. The room went quiet again. From somewhere above them came the muffled sound of wheels on linoleum, someone moving equipment in the corridor. Garrett Novak, Hatch said. How much do you know about him? I know his name is Garrett Novak because you told me last night. Before that, I knew he was someone who'd been professionally targeted, was accustomed to physical trauma, and had training that kept him from panicking when he should have. That's all? That's observation. I didn't know him. Hatch looked down at the table, then back up. He's an operational asset with naval intelligence. He's been running a surveillance operation against a criminal network that's been contracting assassination services to... He stopped. That's as much as I'm going to say in a room like this. She recognized the phrase coming back. Fair enough. The people who sent the man upstairs aren't done, he said. Novak is still alive, which means he's still a liability to them. We're going to move him to a secure facility today. The operation shifts from here. He paused. You saved his life twice in the last 12 hours. Once, she said. The diner was the first time. What happened upstairs was just preventing something. Twice, he said, and didn't elaborate. I'd like to ask you a question that you're not obligated to answer. She waited. The 3 years your public record doesn't account for, he said. Whatever you did, wherever you were, does it have anything to do with the kind of people who sent someone to that room upstairs? She looked at him, at the careful phrasing, the deliberately open structure of the question. He wasn't asking her to confirm classified material. He was asking whether she recognized the shape of what they were facing. I don't know, she said, and it was the most honest thing she'd said in the room. I'd need to know more about who contracted the hit. Hatch nodded slowly. That wasn't the answer he'd been hoping for, but it was one he could work with. Get some rest, he said. We'll be in contact. She stood. At the door, she turned back. The administrator here is going to try to formally suspend my credentials pending investigation. If that happens, I lose access to this building. She said it without inflection, stating a fact. I don't know if that matters to your operation. He didn't answer immediately. Then, I'll make a call. She left. She did not go home and rest. She went to the hospital cafeteria, got a coffee, she actually drank this time, and sat at a corner table with a view of both exits and worked through what she knew. Garrett Novak had been targeted in Harlow, Montana, which was not a coincidence. Harlow was small enough that a federal asset running surveillance could plausibly operate here without institutional attention. The people running the contracted killing were good enough to track him here, good enough to put a ghost in the building within hours of his transfer, and organized enough to have a support vehicle waiting at the loading dock. They were also sloppy enough that the ghost had operated alone on the 4th floor and hadn't accounted for a variable like her. That meant something. Either they'd underestimated the security, or they'd underestimated the variable, or both. In her experience, professionals who were sloppy in one way were usually sloppy in a pattern. She turned the morning over in her mind the way she turned a problem over during a long shift, setting it aside, picking it up, looking at a different edge of it. The man in the wrong scrubs had known which room. He'd had a syringe already prepared, which meant he'd either brought the compound with him or had a contact inside the hospital who'd gotten it for him. The preparation suggested advanced knowledge of Novak's specific transfer, which was information that should have been restricted. Someone on the inside had talked, not necessarily a Harlow regional employee. The transfer decision had been made somewhere up the chain, Billings, or wherever Hatch's people were running this from. The leak could be anywhere in that chain. She was still sitting with that when the cafeteria door opened and Dell came in, still in scrubs, 30 minutes past the end of what had been Dell's shift. She stood in the doorway for a moment, scanning the room, and when she saw Mara, she came over and sat down across from her without being asked. "They're saying a security guard was attacked on the 4th floor," Dell said. "He'll be okay. And that you were involved." "I was there." Dell looked at her coffee. Dell was 53, had raised 2 kids largely alone after a divorce in her late 30s, and had the specific, exhausted pragmatist energy of someone who had learned to read situations fast because the alternative was being caught off guard. "Are you in trouble?" "Probably." "Is it the kind of trouble I should be worried about, like for the hospital?" "I don't know yet." Mara looked at her. "I'm sorry I put you in that position this morning, asking you to keep me out of the system." Dell shrugged, but it wasn't dismissive. It was the shrug of someone recalibrating. "I looked up the federal registration for that patient, Garrett Novak. The transfer order came through at 5 this morning. I was the one who authorized the room assignment." "I know. I put him in 412 because it's at the end of the corridor, more isolated. I thought it would be, I don't know, easier to monitor. It was a reasonable call. Except someone got to him anyway." Dell's voice was even, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. "Mara, I've worked this ER for 20 years. I've seen a lot of people come through here. I've seen trauma nurses, combat vets who went into medicine, people with—" She stopped. "I've never seen anyone move through a building the way you moved through it this morning." Mara said nothing. "I'm not asking you to explain yourself," Dell said. "I just want to know if you're going to be okay." It was the kind of question that was harder to answer than it looked, so Mara answered the functional version of it. "I'm not in physical danger right now. The federal detail is still here and they're moving Novak today." "And after that?" "I don't know." Dell was quiet for a moment. Then she stood, tucked her chair back in, and said, "There's a lockout procedure for the west stairwell. I'm going to put it in place retroactively starting from 0600. It'll look like a scheduled maintenance thing." She said it neutrally, looking at the table. "If anyone asks about the door being ajar, there's a service log entry that can explain it." Mara looked up at her. "You didn't ask me to do that," Dell said. "I'm just doing it." She left, and Mara sat there with the coffee going cold in her hands, and something in her chest that she didn't have a clean name for. Hatch's people moved Novak at 1400 hours. She wasn't there for it. She was back in her apartment by then, finally, having retrieved her phone from her locker during the window when the 4th floor corridor was crowded enough that no one was tracking individual movements. She had 2 missed calls from an unknown number, which she didn't return, and a voicemail from HR at Harlow Regional informing her that her administrative leave was being extended pending a credentialing review and that she should not enter clinical spaces in the hospital until the review was complete. She didn't delete the message. She filed it in a folder on her phone that she'd never named. She was sitting at her kitchen table trying to eat a bowl of soup she'd made from whatever was in the refrigerator, but not because she was hungry, but because she hadn't eaten since the coffee. When her phone rang, the same unknown number. She answered it. The voice on the other end was not one she'd expected. It was Garrett Novak. She recognized it from 3 words, the particular cadence, the specific absence of preamble. He sounded like someone who'd been unconscious 8 hours ago and was operating now on willpower and whatever the medical team had put in him. "Ms. Voss," he said, "you should be resting. I've been informed of what happened this morning." His voice was measured, controlled in the way of someone who kept things controlled as a practice, not as an effort. "I wanted to make the call myself. You don't owe me anything. That's not why I'm calling." A pause. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it directly." "All right. When you were in the room this morning, before my people got there, were you aware of a second individual? Not the one in the scrubs. Someone else." She went still. "Why are you asking me that?" she said. "Because the man we took into custody this morning isn't talking, but the van in the parking lot had a tracker on it. Our team found it 3 miles south on the service road. They found the van, no driver, which means there were at least 2 and one of them is still unaccounted for." She put the spoon down. "I didn't see a second person," she said. I saw the van from the dock door. One visible occupant, driver's seat. The tracker suggests it stopped twice before it was abandoned. Once at the hospital, once at a location that puts it in proximity to your apartment building. The sentence landed in the kitchen like something physical. She turned to look at the window. The blinds were angled down, the way she kept them. The street below was ordinary. A couple walking a dog, a car pulling out of a parallel space. Ordinary in the way that had stopped meaning anything to her around the 3rd year of her service, when ordinary became the thing you looked through rather than at. They're still collecting, she said. Not a question. We think so. Which means you're not clear. He paused. I'm going to arrange for... Don't, she said. Ms. Voss, if your people come to this apartment, whoever is watching it will know you flagged me as a concern. That changes the calculus. Right now, they may not be sure how much I know or what I represent to your investigation. She kept her voice even. Let me handle my own exposure. Silence on the line. You're not a field operative, he said. Whatever your record says, I know what I am, she said, and I know what that situation requires. Give me 24 hours before you do anything official. Another pause, longer this time. 12, he said. She almost argued. She didn't. Fine. There's one more thing, Novak said, and his voice shifted. Not softer, but less operational. Something underneath the control moved. My handler is going to want to debrief you formally. What you did in that room, the technique, the response time, it's going to raise questions up the chain, questions about who you are. Questions that were going to get raised eventually, she said. Yes. He paused again. I just wanted you to be prepared. She looked at the soup she wasn't eating. At the kitchen she'd assembled over 2 years with the specific low-investment practicality of someone who never fully expected to stay somewhere. I've been prepared for that for a long time, she said. She ended the call. She sat for another minute with the phone in her hand. Then she got up, rinsed the bowl, and started packing the case from behind the water heater. Not everything. Just what mattered, and only what she could carry if she needed to move fast. She was halfway through when she heard it, not from the street. From the stairwell inside the building, the interior stairwell she'd chosen this apartment partly for, the one that connected to the alley exit on the east side rather than the main entrance on the west. Footsteps. Deliberate. 1 floor below and climbing. Not her landlord, not a neighbor. The cadence was wrong, too even, too measured, with a pause at each landing that was the pause of someone listening rather than walking. Mara closed the case quietly and set it beside the radiator. She looked at the apartment, the window, the door, the narrow hall that connected kitchen to bedroom, the fire escape that ran along the east wall outside the bedroom window. She picked up the folding knife she'd taken from the man in room 412, the one she'd meant to hand over and hadn't. She stood with her back to the kitchen wall beside the door, weight forward, and waited. The footsteps reached the 2nd floor landing, stopped. The silence lasted long enough that she started revising her read. Then the door at the base of the stairwell opened, and a voice said, quietly but distinctly, the kind of voice that knew how to carry in a tight space without echoing. Mara Voss, my name is Colonel Artis Trent. I'm with the Army. We spoke 6 years ago briefly at a debrief in Fort Carson. I need you to open the door. She didn't move for a full 5 seconds. She knew the name. She knew the name, and she knew what it meant that this woman was standing in her stairwell in Harlow, Montana, and she knew that the 12 hours Novak had given her had just been rendered irrelevant. Whatever she'd been running from, or waiting for, or quietly preparing for, in every apartment in every town she'd lived in since her discharge, it had arrived. She opened the door. Colonel Artis Trent was shorter than Mara remembered. That was the first thing. Not a useful thing, just the thing her brain registered in the 2 seconds it took to process the reality of the woman standing in her doorway. Late 50s, gray hair cut short and practical, the kind of posture that came from decades of wearing weight on your back and learning to distribute it correctly. She had a duffel bag over one shoulder and civilian clothes that were as clearly not her natural register as Mara's scrubs were hers. She was alone, or appeared to be, and she was looking at Mara the way people looked at something they'd been trying to locate for a long time. You going to let me in? Trent said. Mara stepped back. Trent came inside, set the bag down, and looked at the apartment with the brief, comprehensive scan of someone assessing a space for operational purposes rather than aesthetic ones. She looked at the case by the radiator. She looked at the knife in Mara's hand. "Put that away," she said. Not harshly. Factually. Mara folded it and set it on the counter. "Sit down," Trent said. "This is my apartment." "Then sit down in your apartment." She pulled out one of the kitchen chairs and sat in it herself, which settled the point without argument. Mara sat across from her. Trent put a phone on the table between them. Not her phone. A different one. The kind that was encrypted at a level Mara recognized. On its screen was a file. Even from across the table, she could see her own photograph at the top. "How much do you know about what Novak was tracking?" Trent said. "Almost nothing. He's naval intelligence. Criminal network, contracted killing. That's everything Hatch told me." "Hatch told you the edges." Trent pulled the phone back and looked at the screen herself, not reading. She knew what was on it. "The network is called, internally, Vector. No K, for reasons I've never been adequately explained. They've been operating primarily in the Mountain West for about 4 years, providing contract elimination services to clients who need things done without institutional fingerprints. Local corruption cases, federal witnesses, corporate disputes that went lateral." She looked up. 3 months ago, Novak got close enough to identify a domestic node. Someone inside the government feeding them targets and logistics support. "Someone inside which part of the government?" Mara said. "That's the part we don't fully know yet." Trent's voice was precise and unhurried. "What we know is that Novak's surveillance was compromised 12 days ago. He'd been running dark since then. No check-ins, no digital footprint. He surfaced in Harlow because this was his fallback location. He had a contact here." "Who?" "Dead, found 3 days ago outside Billings. Looked like a traffic accident." She paused. "It wasn't." Mara processed that. "So when he came through the diner door last night, he'd been moving on foot for most of the day. The wound was from the previous night. He managed it himself for approximately 18 hours before he ran out of capacity." Trent looked at her steadily. "He came to the diner because it's 3 blocks from where his contact used to live. He was trying to reach a secondary cache the contact had established." "He didn't know the contact was dead?" "No." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the dog-walking couple had moved on. The car that had been parallel parking was gone. "Why are you here?" Mara said. "Not Hatch. Not someone from Novak's chain. You." Trent was quiet for a moment. She had the stillness of someone who'd learned to think before speaking as a professional discipline rather than a social one. "Because what you did in that diner and what you did on the 4th floor of that hospital this morning has now been seen by a sufficient number of federal personnel that your file is going to get pulled by people who have the clearance to pull it." She paused. "And when that happens, certain questions are going to be asked. And I would prefer to have spoken to you before those questions are asked." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that involve your discharge." Trent held her gaze. "And the operation you were running in the 18 months prior to it." There it was. Mara had known it was coming, had known since the man in the wrong scrubs had hit the floor, and she'd registered the look on Krella's face. Had known, in a less immediate way, since the morning she'd filled out the employment application at Harlow Regional and written the sanitized version of her history in the boxes that asked for it. She'd known, and she'd chosen not to think about it, which was not the same as being unprepared. "You were my commanding officer for 14 months, Mara said. "Yes." "You signed my discharge paperwork." "Yes." "Then you already know what's in the file." Trent looked at her. "I know what I put in the file. I don't always know what happened after I put it there." She set her hands flat on the table, not a threatening gesture, something more like grounding. "Mara, I need to know if there's anything in what you did during that last operation that connects to what Novak has been tracking." The question sat in the air between them. Mara looked at the table, at the grain of the wood, the old ring mark from a coffee cup she'd set down too many times in the same spot, at the small cracks at the edge where the laminate was starting to separate from whatever was underneath. "There was a name," she said, "during the debrief. An organization. It wasn't fully identified at the time. We had structure without leadership, which was the problem. We never got a name." "Vector." She looked up. Trent's expression had not changed, but something behind it had. We believe the operation you were running in your last deployment was targeting the early infrastructure of what became Vector. You didn't know the name because they didn't have it yet. They were 3 separate nodes operating without a connecting identity. She paused. 2 of those nodes were disrupted by your team's work. The third one wasn't. Because the operation was pulled, Mara said, and she kept her voice completely flat with the effort of someone lifting something heavy. Before we finished it. Yes. Why was it pulled? Trent looked at her for a long moment. That's the part I couldn't put in your file. The silence between them lasted long enough to become its own thing. Someone shut it down, Mara said. Someone with the authority to shut it down, yes. And the reason given, the official reason, was mission scope creep and risk of international incident. The unofficial reason was... Trent stopped. Started again. We think the third node had already established a contact inside the domestic intelligence structure at that point. Someone who had enough reach to get an active field operation killed without leaving fingerprints on the order. Mara sat with that. The math of it was cold and straightforward. The operation she'd spent 14 months running, the operation that had cost her team members and her own career, it had been killed not by enemy action and not by institutional failure in the ordinary sense, but by the very network they'd been hunting, reaching back through its domestic contact to cut the thread before it could be followed to its source. The discharge, she said, the irregularities in my record, were a consequence of the shutdown, yes. When an operation is killed that way, everything connected to it gets compressed. The documentation becomes minimal. People who were involved become difficult to verify. Trent's voice was even, but there was something underneath it that had weight. I did what I could with what I had authority to do. It wasn't enough. Mara said nothing for a moment. It's why Linda Hosh can put me on administrative leave, she said. And why Harlow Regional's HR is going to find irregularities in my credentialing. Yes. Because the people we were hunting made sure my ability to verify what I did would be limited. They didn't do it specifically to you, Trent said. It was systemic. Everyone connected to that operation had their records compressed, but you were the operational lead, which meant your file was the most consequential to minimize. She paused. You've been dealing with the fallout of that for 3 years without knowing the full cause. Mara stood up. She went to the window and looked out, not because there was anything to see, but because she needed to be vertical and in motion for a moment. The street was still ordinary. The mountains to the west were the color of old iron in the late afternoon light. 3 years of applications that needed extra explanation. 3 years of references that didn't fully connect. 3 years of choosing small places where the questions would be smaller. She'd thought it was the cost of the work. She hadn't been wrong exactly. She just hadn't known who was collecting the payment. What do you need from me? She said, still looking at the window. Your formal cooperation with Novak's investigation. Specifically, everything you remember from the last operation, targeting data, communication intercepts, structural analysis. Things that weren't in the official record because they couldn't be by the time the record was closed. Trent paused. And your identification of the domestic contact, if you can give it. You were closer to the source than anyone. If there's a face, a voice, a behavioral signature you recognized and filed away. I don't have a name, Mara said. But she turned from the window. There was a communication intercept 3 weeks before the operation was pulled. I flagged it up the chain as a potential indicator of internal compromise. It was acknowledged and filed. I never heard anything about it again. Trent was very still. What was in the intercept, she said. A reference to operational timing, specific timing, the kind that only 3 people outside my team would have had access to. One of them was civilian side, DoD liaison. I don't have the name anymore. I only ever had an identifier. She paused. But there was a phrase used in the intercept that wasn't tactical language. It was administrative language, very specific. The kind of phrasing that comes from someone who writes policy documents, not field reports. Can you reproduce the phrase? I wrote it down, a long time ago. She went to the case by the radiator. Not the SAT phone, not the ID card. Underneath those, a folded paper she'd told herself she never read anymore. She'd read it approximately 40 times in 3 years. She unfolded it and set it on the table. Trent looked at it. The particular quality of her stillness changed. You recognize it, Mara said. I've seen a variation of this phrasing, Trent said slowly, in a document I wasn't supposed to have access to, 18 months ago. During a review of... She stopped. It matches the communication style of a specific individual in the defense oversight structure. Who? I can't say that in this room. Trent looked up. I need to say it in the right room, with the right people present, with documentation that can be verified. If I say it to you here and now, it's two people in an apartment in Montana making an accusation against someone with significant institutional protection. Then we need to be in the right room, Mara said. That's why I came to you first. Trent refolded the paper carefully and set it back on the table. I can get you into a formal debrief within 48 hours. Secure location, the right clearances, people with the authority to act on what you bring. She paused. But it means your cover here is over. Harlow, the hospital, this apartment. You're done with this version of your life. Mara looked at the apartment, the kitchen she'd stalked slowly over 2 years. The view of the dry cleaner's sign she'd learned to read as a weather indicator. The neon flickered when moisture was moving in from the west. The floor she'd slept on more times than the bed. She'd known this version was temporary. She'd known it the way you know something you choose not to examine, peripherally, from the side, with just enough distance that it doesn't demand a response. 48 hours, she said. Yes. What do I do until then? Stay off the grid as much as possible. Don't contact Novak or Hatch directly. Don't... Trent stopped, and her expression shifted in the almost imperceptible way of someone who has just registered something they'd been expecting and hoping not to register. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it, and the quality of the moment changed entirely. What? Mara said. Trent turned the phone. A text. 3 words from a number that showed only as a letter number combination. Novak transport compromised. They both looked at it for the same half-second. They tracked the transfer, Mara said. Or they had someone on the transport itself. Trent was already standing, already pulling the duffel bag strap over her shoulder. Novak's in a federal vehicle somewhere on Route 9 between here and Billings. How many people in the transport? Driver, 2 security, a medical officer. 4 people. A compromised vehicle somewhere on a 2-lane highway through open country with no cover and approximately 17 miles between the nearest populated points. Mara was already moving toward the bedroom. I need 30 seconds. We don't have 30 seconds. She went to the closet and pulled down a bag she'd had packed for exactly this kind of contingency since the week she moved in. Not the flat case. That stayed. This was operational kit, the things she'd told herself she was keeping out of old habit. A trauma pack configured for field use rather than clinical use, a change of clothes, 2 items she hadn't registered with anyone since her discharge and wasn't going to explain now. She was back in the kitchen in 25 seconds. Trent looked at the bag. Looked at her. Something shifted in the colonel's expression. Not surprise, but recognition. The look of someone seeing a thing confirmed they'd already suspected. You never fully stood down, Trent said. No, Mara said. I didn't. They went out through the east stairwell. Trent had a vehicle 2 blocks over, a dark green SUV with government plates that were plausibly civilian if you didn't look at the mounting brackets. She drove. Mara rode with the trauma pack across her lap, working through the inventory by touch while Trent got them onto Route 9 headed north. The medical officer on the transport, Mara said. Name? Don't have one. The manifest was sent through Hatch's office. Who arranged the transfer? Officially, Hatch. But the routing came from above his pay grade, someone in the Joint Task Force coordinating with Naval Intelligence. Trent's hands were steady on the wheel, but she was doing the same thing Mara was doing, running calculations behind her eyes. If the transport's compromised from within, the medical officer is either a target or an asset they placed. Either way, Novak's exposed in a moving vehicle on open road. Yes, Mara looked at the highway. March in Montana meant the light was already angling low by late afternoon, and the rangeland on either side of Route 9 was the particular flat brown of early spring. Nowhere to go, nothing to hide behind, everything visible from a significant distance. which cut both ways. How far ahead of us is the transport? 20 minutes, maybe less. They left at 14:30. Trent glanced at the dash clock. It's 16:12 now. They should be past the Garrison Junction. Unless something stopped them. The phone buzzed again. Trent glanced at it, couldn't read it safely at speed, and handed it to Mara. Vehicle stopped. Mile marker 47. No contact from detail. Mile marker 47 was 9 miles ahead. Mara knew the stretch. She'd driven Route 9 enough times in 2 years to know where the road bent, where the shoulders dropped, where the drainage culverts ran under the asphalt. At mile 47, there was a long straight section with a pull-off area on the east side, used by truckers and, in summer, by people pulling horse trailers. Open, flat, no approach cover from any direction. Whoever had stopped the vehicle had chosen the worst possible ground for the people inside it. They picked the location, she said. That was my read, too. Mara turned it over. A stopped federal transport vehicle, no contact from the security detail, 9 miles ahead on a highway with essentially no traffic at this hour in this season. The people who'd done this had 20 minutes on them, minimum. They'd had time to establish a perimeter. How many people does Vector typically deploy for a field termination? She said. Best intelligence says 2 to 4. They're not a large operation. They're precise. Trent paused. But precise means they don't leave the job undone. And Novak is still, medically, post-surgical. He received approximately 4 hours of care at Harlow Regional before the transfer. He's not ambulatory on his own. Not reliably. Not ambulatory. Post-surgical. In a stopped vehicle with a security detail that wasn't responding. Drive faster, Mara said. Trent drove faster. The highway unrolled ahead of them in the flat late afternoon light, and Mara went quiet and went internal in the way she'd learned to go internal before operations. Not meditation, nothing structured, just the deliberate clearing of everything that wasn't immediately relevant. The fear and the anger and the 3 years of accumulated quiet and the conversation in the kitchen and the folded paper with its 18 months carried phrase, all of it moved to the periphery, not gone, but not in the way. What was left? The highway, the vehicle, the mile markers counting up toward 47, the trauma pack on her lap, and Garrett Novak in a stopped federal SUV 9 miles ahead with people around it who had already demonstrated they were willing to walk into a hospital in broad daylight. Mile marker 41. When we get there, Trent said, I need you to understand that my authority in this situation is limited. I'm Army. This is a joint federal operation. I can't give you operational directives. I know. So what I'm about to say is not an order. I know that too. Whatever you do out there. Trent stopped, started again. Don't die. Mara almost said something, didn't. Mile marker 44. She could see it now. The shape of the stopped vehicle on the right shoulder, a dark blue federal SUV with its hazard lights going, which was wrong. The hazards were wrong. Nobody in a compromised security detail activated their hazard lights. That was either someone inside the vehicle trying to signal or someone outside it trying to look like a routine breakdown. 2 other vehicles nearby, one pulled off ahead of the federal SUV, a gray sedan, and one 100 yards back on the opposite shoulder, bracketed. Don't stop at the pull-off, Mara said. I wasn't planning to. Pull past the federal vehicle by about 80 yards and stop on the shoulder. Stay in the car. Mara, Colonel. She looked at Trent directly. Stay in the car. Trent said nothing, which was, for someone of her rank and disposition, as close to agreement as the situation allowed. They came in at speed and Trent braked hard, pulling the SUV off the road 83 yards past the federal vehicle. Mara was out the door before the vehicle fully stopped, moving away from the road surface and onto the gravel shoulder, using the angle of the SUV's body as cover for the first 4 seconds while she read the scene. The gray sedan ahead was empty, doors closed, engine off based on the exhaust. No vapor in the cold air. The vehicle behind was occupied, one visible silhouette in the driver's seat. The federal SUV's rear passenger door was open 6 inches. The hazard lights clicked in their slow mechanical rhythm. No visible personnel outside any of the vehicles. which meant the 2 to 4 people Vector had sent were either inside the federal SUV or they'd moved into the drainage ditch that ran along the east shoulder, which provided the only concealment available on this stretch. The ditch. She went low and moved parallel to the road, away from the gravel where footsteps carried, onto the dead grass of the shoulder margin. 15 feet from the federal SUV, she stopped. A man was in the ditch, 6 feet ahead, on one knee, facing away from her, watching the federal vehicle. He had something in his hands that was not a phone. She closed the distance in 4 steps, got her forearm across his throat from behind, and brought him down into the ditch as quietly as you could bring a 190 pounds of resisting person down anywhere. It wasn't quiet. It was controlled. He went unconscious in 11 seconds, and she left him face up so he wouldn't aspirate. She took what he'd been holding, a compact radio handset, and moved to the federal SUV, the rear passenger door at 6 inches. She pulled it open. Novak was inside, conscious, zip-tied at the wrist to the door handle on the opposite side. He looked at her with those same cataloging eyes, and this time what she read in them wasn't a decision being made. It was something considerably more complicated. The driver and 1 security officer were in the front seat, both unconscious. The medical officer was not present. "Where's the 4th person?" she said, keeping her voice just above a breath. "Walked to the sedan 7 minutes ago," he said, equally quiet. "She made a call, came back, then went to the rear vehicle." His voice was strained but functional. "2 others got out of the rear vehicle, walked toward the ditch on the east side. You passed one of them. The other?" He looked toward the west side of the road. Of course. She'd read the ditch on the east because the sedan was east. The west shoulder had a narrower drainage margin, less obvious, which made it better. She was already turning when the rear window of the federal SUV exploded inward. Glass across her back and neck, the simultaneous crack of the shot reaching them half a second later from the west. Suppressed, not silent. Nothing was actually silent, that was television, but low enough that it would not carry far in open air. She dropped flat into the vehicle footwell, pulling the door with her. Novak said tightly, "Exit velocity suggests a rifle at 200 yards minimum. He's not going to rush." "No," she agreed from the footwell. "He's going to wait for a clear angle. The door won't stop a rifle round." "I know." She looked at the zip tie on his wrist. "Do you have any feeling in your hands?" "Some." She pulled the trauma pack. It had come with her through the door, habit, and found the shears in the front pocket. She reached up and cut the tie without exposing anything above the door sill. Novak pulled his wrists down, flexed them once. "Can you move?" she said. "Define move." "Get from here to the front seat in under 3 seconds." He looked at her. At the front seat? At the distance, which was not large and was still, in his condition, significant. "If I have to." "You have to," she said. "In about 20 seconds. I need you driving north. Don't stop until you hit Garrison." "What are you going to be doing?" She was looking at the radio handset she'd taken from the man in the ditch. It was still active, dies. She could hear the carrier signal, the faint electronic breath of an open channel. She pressed the transmit button, held it for 2 seconds. Released. From the rear vehicle, 100 yards back, a door opened. She'd broken their communication protocol, which meant whoever was in that rear vehicle was now uncertain about the status of their people in the field. Uncertainty made people move when they should stay. It was a small disruption, and it lasted maybe 30 seconds, but 30 seconds was what she needed. "Now," she said. Novak moved. It wasn't clean. She could see what it cost him in the set of his jaw and the way he dragged his right side, but he got into the driver's seat and got the vehicle in gear. Mara went out the rear door on the east side and ran low toward the ditch. The rifle on the west shoulder fired twice more. Both rounds went into the federal SUV's passenger door. She heard the impact as she moved, felt the vibration in the ground. The vehicle was accelerating. Novak had it moving. She was in the ditch, running north parallel to the road, when the man in the rear vehicle reached the shoulder and started toward her position. He was faster than she'd have preferred. He was also between her and Trent's SUV, which was the problem she hadn't fully solved yet. Behind her, from the west shoulder, from 200 yards out, she could hear running footsteps on gravel. The rifle position was moving. She stopped, turned, assessed. The federal SUV was gone. Novak had it north and moving, which was the priority, which was the thing that mattered. What she had, a ditch, a radio handset that was now useless, a trauma pack, and two people converging on her position from different vectors with the particular coordinated movement of people who had worked together before. And 40 feet ahead, the gray sedan, doors closed, engine cold, keys almost certainly inside because the person who'd walked to it 7 minutes ago hadn't planned to leave it for long. She ran for the sedan. She was 10 feet from the driver's door when the man from the rear vehicle stepped out of her angle, and she understood, with the specific clarity of a situation that has just removed all ambiguity, that she was not going to make it to the car before he closed the distance. He was bigger than the man in room 412. He was also faster. But he was looking at her hands, not her feet. That was the mistake. She dropped the trauma pack, planted her left foot, and changed direction in a single stride. Not toward the car, toward him, inside his reach before he could recalibrate. She felt the impact of his forearm across her left shoulder, and it was bad. It was going to bruise down to the bone, but she was inside his arms, and she drove her right elbow up into the center of his face twice, fast, without stopping between strikes. He staggered. She did not stop to confirm the result. She turned, covered the 10 feet to the sedan in 4 strides, got the door open, keys in the ignition. She had the sedan in reverse and moving before the door fully closed. The rear window showed her the road, the ditch, the man from the rear vehicle sitting on the gravel holding his face. The rifle position. She still couldn't see the West shooter, which was the problem that was going to stay a problem. She swung the sedan north, got it on the road, and drove. 2 miles up, Route 9 bent slightly east. When she came around the bend, Trent's green SUV was there, stopped sideways across the shoulder with the driver's window down, and Trent looking back at her with an expression that was not quite relief and not quite something else. Mara stopped the sedan alongside it. "Novak's heading to Garrison," she said through the window. "I know. I tracked the federal vehicle." Trent looked at her. At the shoulder, the glass fragment still in her hair from the rear window, the bruising already coming up on the left side of her neck. "You're hurt." "I'm not hurt." "Then, I'm not badly hurt." Trent looked at her for another moment. Then she said, "The rifle shooter. Still on the west shoulder last I saw, moving north." Mara looked in the sedan's rear view, nothing visible yet. "He's going to reach the second man in the ditch eventually and know what happened. We have maybe 4 minutes. Get in my vehicle." "I need to—" "The man in the ditch. I rendered him. He'll need—" "My people are 4 minutes out," Trent said, and the firmness in her voice was not a colonel's authority. It was something more personal, less institutional. "Get in the vehicle, Mara." She got in the vehicle. Trent had them moving north inside 30 seconds, and the road unrolled ahead through the empty rangeland, and Mara sat with glass in her hair and her left shoulder doing something unpleasant, and her hands very steady in her lap, and she watched the mile markers go past and didn't say anything. After a while, Trent said quietly, "You know what's coming next?" "Yes." "The debrief is going to happen faster than 48 hours now. They're going to want everything. The intercept, the phrasing, the full operational record. They're going to want it documented and verified." "I know. And the person we think is behind this, the domestic contact, when that name gets confirmed, it's going to be significant, the kind of significant that doesn't stay contained." Trent paused. "Are you ready for that?" Mara looked at the road. She thought about the soup going cold on her kitchen table, the case by the radiator with the photo she didn't look at anymore, the ring mark on the laminate, the 20 months of small mornings that had almost convinced her she was done with this. "I've been ready," she said. "I just didn't know what I was ready for." Trent nodded. Then her phone rang. Not the encrypted one, her regular phone, and she answered it with one hand on the wheel and listened for approximately 5 seconds, and her face went through a change that Mara caught from the side and couldn't fully read. Trent ended the call. "That was Hatch," she said. "What happened?" "Novak made it to Garrison." A pause. "He's in the hospital there." "That's the right call. He needed—" "That's not the part." Trent's voice had something in it now that hadn't been there before. "The medical officer. The one who wasn't in the federal SUV. She was found at the Garrison city limits, on foot. She'd been walking for approximately an hour." "What did she tell them?" She said she left the vehicle when the stop was arranged. She knew it was coming because she'd been briefed on the route. She said she was ordered to leave by her supervisor and told the stop was a sanctioned security measure. Trent paused. She gave them her supervisor's name. And the SUV went over a frost heave in the road and shuddered. The supervisor, Trent said carefully, is the same DOD liaison identifier you had in your intercept. Mara turned to look at her. We have a name, Trent said. Hatch has a name, and the name belongs to someone who is currently in a federal building in Washington with a security clearance that is going to make the next 24 hours complicated. The word landed in the moving vehicle and sat there, and Mara looked at the road ahead and understood that the thing she'd spent 3 years not being done with had just become inescapable and immediate and real. How complicated, she said. Trent looked at her once, briefly, and then looked back at the road. He's currently sitting on the Senate Oversight Subcommittee, she said, for Defense Intelligence Operations. The name was Senator Philip Crane. Mara let it sit in the vehicle for a moment the way you let something sit when it's too large to process immediately. Not because she didn't understand it. She understood it precisely. But because understanding something and absorbing it were different operations, and she'd learned not to conflate them. Philip Crane. She knew the name the way anyone who'd spent time adjacent to defense oversight knew it, from briefing headers, from chain of command documents, from the particular bureaucratic atmosphere that surrounded Senate subcommittee work like a weather system. She'd never been in a room with him. She'd seen his name on documents that shaped the operational parameters of work she'd done, which was a strange kind of proximity. The kind where you're affected by someone without them knowing you exist. He'd known she existed now. Or rather, he'd known that her operation existed, and he'd reached into it and closed his hand around it. And she'd spent 3 years thinking it was institutional failure rather than a specific human decision made by a specific human being in a specific room somewhere that she'd never been able to identify. Does Hatch have enough to move on him? She said. The medical officer's statement is a start. It's not enough. Trent kept her eyes on the road. Crane has been in that subcommittee seat for 9 years. He has relationships with every relevant oversight mechanism. Any move against him that isn't ironclad gets one chance and then disappears. What do they need? Documentation, the kind that doesn't rely on witness testimony alone. Trent paused. The intercept you kept. Mara looked at the trauma pack between her feet. That's a handwritten note on a piece of paper. I don't have the original signal data. The original signal data is in an archive. Trent glanced at her. We found it 4 months ago. It was compressed into a maintenance record database during the shutdown. Not deleted, just buried under 40 layers of routine filing. Our people are confident they can extract it and verify the chain of custody. She paused. Your note corroborates the content independently. 2 separate sources of the same data. Is that enough? Combined with the medical officer's statement and the physical evidence from Novak's operation, Hatch believes yes. Another pause. The Inspector General's office has been briefed, quietly. They've been building a parallel file for 6 weeks. 6 weeks. While she'd been writing nursing notes in Harlow Regional and eating soup from whatever was in the refrigerator. Why didn't anyone contact me 6 weeks ago? She said. Trent was quiet for a moment. Because we weren't sure which direction your loyalty ran. Mara turned to look at her. You were pulled from an active operation and your record was compromised, and you disappeared into Montana and didn't make contact with anyone from your previous service, Trent said carefully. That's a profile that reads 2 ways. Either you were protecting yourself from the people who'd shut you down, or you'd been turned and you were protecting yourself from the people you'd been running the operation against. She held the wheel steady. I knew which one it was. Not everyone agreed with me. Who decided? Novak? Ultimately. He'd been running surveillance on Vector's domestic contact for 11 months. When the Harlow connection surfaced, when we understood that Crane had a logistical node operating in this area, Novak requested authorization to surface here. He chose Harlow specifically. She paused. He chose it because you were here. The road ran north, and the light was going fully now, the mountains to the west swallowing the last of the afternoon. The sedan was still behind them, no longer visible in the mirror. He was testing me, Mara said. He was confirming. There's a difference. Trent's voice was measured. He needed to know if you'd help a federal asset or walk past him. He needed to see what you'd do with the information. And he needed to know if you still had operational capacity or if 3 years of civilian life had changed the calculus. And the hospital, the transfer to Harlow Regional. His idea. Yes. She sat with that. The diner, the late-night intervention, the federal agents appearing with their clean suits and their questions, not entirely spontaneous. Staged in the way that operations were sometimes staged, where the core event was real and the framing was managed. Novak had genuinely been wounded. Someone had genuinely tried to kill him in that hospital room, but his presence in Harlow, the specific gravity that had pulled everything toward her apartment stairwell and Colonel Trent's voice, that had been a choice. He put himself at risk to confirm my profile, she said. He was already at risk. Vector had already tracked him. He chose to surface here rather than somewhere else. Trent glanced at her again, briefly. I want to be honest with you about this because you're about to walk into a debrief where some of these people have been making calculations about you for months, and I think you should know the shape of what happened before you're in that room. I appreciate that. You may not in about 48 hours. I know. She looked at the road. It doesn't change the information. They reached Garrison at 1840. It was a larger town than Harlow, county seat, a hospital with actual surgical capacity, the kind of place where federal vehicles didn't draw significant attention because the Federal Land Management Office had a regional headquarters there. Trent pulled into the hospital's secondary entrance, and they went through 3 sets of credentials to reach the floor where Novak had been taken. He was in surgery when they arrived. The wound from the night before, the original injury, the one she'd stabilized in the diner, had been further compromised by the physical movement during the transport escape. The surgeon on call was someone Mara didn't know, which was fine. She sat outside the OR in a plastic chair and let a nurse look at her shoulder and her neck and the glass fragments that were still working their way out of her hair. And she did not think about what was happening in the operating room because that wasn't a productive use of the next hour. Hatch arrived 30 minutes after they did. He came with 2 people she hadn't seen before, a man in his 40s with a DOJ identification that she read in the half-second he flashed it, and a woman who didn't show identification at all and whose name Hatch did not offer. They set up in a family consultation room down the hall from the OR. Someone produced a recording device, which Hatch put on the table between them without comment. I'm going to ask you some questions, Hatch said. You can have legal representation present if you want it. This is voluntary. I know, she said. No representation. Ask. What followed was 2 hours and 40 minutes of the most precise professional conversation she'd had in 3 years. Hatch was good. She'd assessed him as competent in the sheriff's interview room in Harlow, and this confirmed it. He asked questions in sequence, and he listened to the answers, and he didn't ask the same thing twice in different phrasing, which was a tell for either respect or genuine skill. The DOJ man took notes. The woman who hadn't given her name sat near the door and watched Mara, the way someone watched something they were still deciding about. She told them everything. The operation, the structure of the 3 nodes, the specific communication intercept, and the administrative phrasing that had flagged it for her, the chain of reports she'd filed that had gone nowhere, the shutdown and the debrief at Fort Carson where she'd spent 4 hours being thanked for her service in language that carefully didn't specify what the service had been. She told them about the note. She handed it across the table. The DOJ man photographed it immediately. The phrase itself, Hatch said, looking at it. You're confident this is verbatim. I wrote it down within the hour. I have a good verbal memory. She paused. It was the word disposition that flagged it for me. It's not a word operators use. It's policy language, the kind of word you use when you're writing about assets from a structural remove. Rather than when you're in the field. Yes. Whoever wrote the communication was thinking in terms of case management, not tactical response. That's an administrative mindset. She looked at Hatch. It's how someone thinks when they manage operations from a committee table. The woman by the door said, for the first time, Did you share this flag with your commanding officer at the time? Yes. Colonel Trent received my report. And before that, your immediate superior in the field. He was already gone by then, 18 days before the operation was pulled. She kept her voice level. Vehicle accident, officially. The woman's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did. Hatch said, "We're going to need a formal sworn statement. That can happen here or at a secure federal facility in the next 72 hours. Your choice." "Here," she said. "Tonight, if possible." He looked at the DOJ man. Something passed between them. "Tonight," Hatch said. The sworn statement took another 90 minutes. By the time it was done, the surgeon had come out of the OR to say that Novak's condition was stable and that whoever had managed his original injury had probably saved his life twice over. The compression had preserved vascular integrity that would otherwise have been gone by the time they got to him. The surgeon said this in passing and went back down the hall without knowing who he was talking to. Mara sat with that for a moment. Then she went to find a vending machine because she hadn't eaten since morning and the soup didn't count and she was running on nothing, which was a thing she'd learned to manage but not to pretend wasn't happening. The vending machine in the Garrison Hospital's second-floor alcove was out of everything useful, and she got crackers and a coffee from the machine beside it and stood there eating crackers in the fluorescent light of a hospital corridor at 2200 hours, which was not the strangest place she'd ever eaten crackers. Trent found her there. "IG has opened a formal investigation," she said. She leaned against the wall beside the machine. Crane's office was notified an hour ago that certain documentation related to a defense oversight matter was under review. They were not told the specific nature. How long before he understands what's coming? His people are good. Hours, maybe. Not days. Trent looked at the coffee in Mara's hand. He's going to move to protect himself. That's predictable. The question is which direction he moves. Does he have more assets in the field? Vector had 3 active operators in the Mountain West. One is in federal custody, the man from the hospital. One is the man you left in the ditch on Route 9, who was taken by Hatch's team. The third is unaccounted for. The rifle shooter. Yes. She ate a cracker. What does Crane know about me? As of this afternoon, he knows a Harlow regional nurse intervened in the Novak situation. He may know more by now. His contact in the transport chain was the medical officer, and she's in federal custody and presumably no longer communicating with him. But he's a careful man. He'll have been running parallel information gathering. So he knows my name. Probably. And he knows I gave a statement. He will within hours. She finished the coffee, which was bad, and put the cup in the trash. The third operator, she said. The rifle shooter. If Crane is moving to protect himself and his field resources are down to one active person, what's the most logical play? Trent looked at her. You're the most direct threat to him right now. You have independent corroboration of the intercept. Your sworn statement is now in federal hands, but Crane doesn't know how much he can suppress at the IG level or how quickly. So the play is to discredit or remove the witness. Yes. Trent said it plainly because that was who she was. You're the witness. Then we need to let him try, Mara said. Trent stared at her. If the third operator comes for me and we take him, we have 3 people in federal custody who can be walked backward to Crane. Each one is a link. 3 links is a chain. She looked at Trent. Right now, we have documentation and testimony, a good defense attorney, and 9 years of institutional relationships, and enough ambiguity in the record can put doubt around documentation and testimony. Mara, I'm not suggesting I stand in an open field. She kept her voice practical. I'm suggesting we use the next 12 hours to make it easy for the third operator to locate me, in a controlled environment with Hatch's people in position. She paused. It's a compression, not an execution. Trent was quiet for a moment. You'd be the bait. I've been the bait since the diner, she said. I'd just like to stop pretending I'm not. Hatch agreed because Hatch was a practical man, and because the logic held, and because he was tired in the visible, structural way of someone who'd been running an operation with inadequate resources for too long and could see the end of it from where he was standing. They worked out the shape of it in the consultation room with a map of Garrison and Hatch's operational team, which turned out to be 5 people, which was fewer than she'd expected. Trent sat in on the planning and did not say much, and at one point said something specific about sightlines that revised the room positioning, and nobody commented on the input from the Army colonel, who was officially there in a different capacity. The operational logic was straightforward. Mara would be documented as having left the hospital. Her location would be traceable through a phone Hatch's team configured. Not her phone, a dedicated device with a signal that could be read by anyone running active surveillance on federal personnel involved in the case. The third operator would need to move quickly before the IG investigation locked down Crane's access to resources. She was given a room in a garrison motel 2 blocks from the hospital. Not a nice room. The kind of room where the heater ran loud and the window lock was marginal and the parking lot was visible from 3 angles. She lay on the bed and looked at the ceiling and did not sleep, which was fine. She hadn't expected to sleep. At 2:14 in the morning, the window lock failed, which was not accidental, and the person who came through it was not the third operator. She knew that immediately because the person who came through the window moved with the specific hesitation of someone who was uncertain about the interior layout, and a trained operator would have had the layout before coming through the window. This person was improvising. She turned on the bedside lamp. The man who'd stopped moving when the light came on was approximately 30, in civilian clothes, with the particular expression of someone who'd just realized that the situation they'd walked into was not the situation they'd prepared for. He had a weapon. He did not have it raised. "Put it on the floor," she said. He looked at her, at the room, at the absence of what he'd apparently expected to find. "Floor," she said. He put it on the floor. "Who sent you?" she said. He said nothing. "You're not a professional," she said. "The window gave you away. A professional would have cut the lock before applying pressure. You forced it." She looked at him steadily. "Which means you're not the third operator. You're someone who was given a number and an address and a reason." His jaw moved. "How much did they pay you?" she said. "I'm not—" He stopped. "You're not what?" "I'm not getting paid." He said it with a specific emphasis that was harder to read than anger. "I owe someone. They said this was how I clear it." She looked at him for a moment. Young, scared, not equipped for what he'd walked into, doing something stupid in the particular way of someone who'd run out of other options. Nothing about the situation was what it had been framed to her as. Not another trained vector asset, but a civilian leverage point. Someone Crane's network had reached through a completely different channel. "Sit down," she said. He didn't move. "I'm not going to hurt you. Sit down." He sat on the edge of the single chair by the desk. "What did they tell you about who was in this room?" she said. "That you were—" He stopped again. "That you had information that would hurt people, that they needed it back." "What people?" "They didn't say." "Who gave you the number?" He gave her a name. She didn't recognize it. She repeated it, making sure she had it right. "And they told you to come here and do what, exactly?" "Get your phone, get whatever documents you had on you." He looked at the floor. "If you weren't cooperative—" He didn't finish. "I understand," she said. "What do you owe them?" "Money. A lot of it. I made some bad decisions and I needed—" He stopped. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to you." She looked at him. "You're going to tell everything you just told me to the federal agents who are currently in the parking lot. You're going to give them the name, the number, everything. And then you're going to have a conversation with a DOJ attorney about your situation, which is complicated, but not as complicated as you think." He stared at her. "Why would you—" "Because you're not who I was expecting," she said simply. "And because the people who sent you to this room knew that. They didn't send you to succeed. They sent you to see whether I was here alone or covered." The weight of that landed on him visibly. "They used you as a probe," she said, "to see the shape of what they're facing. They already know you're not coming back with a phone." She paused. "That means they now know I'm covered, which means the third operator isn't coming here." She picked up the phone on the nightstand, the configured device, Hatch's device, and called the number for the agent in the parking lot. It took 4 minutes for the room to fill with people. The young man with the gun on the floor was taken out without drama. Hatch came in last, looked at the scene, and looked at Mara. "Not the shooter," he said. "No, a civilian leverage asset, but he gave me a contact name." She gave it to him. Follow it up the chain, and I think you'll find it connects to the same network through a different node. Crane's been running two contact layers, the vector operators for direct action and a civilian debt leverage network for low-risk reconnaissance. Hatch looked at her. You got all that from a scared kid with a gun. I got all that from the fact that a scared kid with a gun came through my window instead of a trained shooter. She looked at the window, the bent lock. The shooter knew I was covered. He sent the kid to confirm it, which means the shooter has a communication line to Crane or to someone close to Crane that's still active. She paused. And that means we can still find it. Hatch stood for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call and walked out of the room, and she could hear from the corridor the tone of the conversation shifting into something that moved faster and with more purpose than anything had moved in the last 6 hours. She went to the window and looked at the parking lot. She was still there when Trent appeared in the doorway behind her. The IG released a statement 40 minutes ago, Trent said. Not a public one. An internal notice to the relevant oversight bodies. They've named the subject of the investigation. Mara turned. Crane's chief of staff contacted the IG's office 20 minutes after the notice went out, Trent continued. Officially, it was a request for clarification of scope. Unofficially, she paused. Hatch's contact inside the IG says it read like a man trying to determine how much of the wall had already fallen. And Crane is scheduled to appear before a closed session of the Armed Services Committee tomorrow morning at 9. He doesn't know the IG investigation is the reason the session was called. He was told it was routine quarterly oversight. Trent looked at her steadily. He's going to walk into that room expecting to chair part of the agenda. Instead, he's going to find the IG, 2 DOJ attorneys, and a sealed evidence package. With my statement in it. With your statement in it, and the Intercept archive, and the medical officer's testimony, and the chain of custody documentation from Novak's operation. Trent paused. It's not the kind of thing you recover from. Not at his level. The moment he's in that room, his ability to suppress or redirect ends. Mara looked at the parking lot. A cold Montana night, the kind that settled into the bones without drama. The motel sign across the lot was missing 2 letters, and the ones that remained buzzed faintly. 3 years of small apartments and careful smallness, and the specific loneliness of being someone whose real life existed in a file nobody could fully access. 3 years of forms with gaps in them, and conversations she'd kept shallow, and the particular discipline of not explaining herself. She'd thought she was hiding. She'd actually been waiting, which were different positions even when they looked the same from the outside. What happens to my record, she said. That's part of what gets corrected when the investigation concludes. Trent stepped further into the room. Your service documentation gets restored, the compressed file gets expanded. The discharge is reclassified, honorably, fully, with the operational record attached. She paused. Harlow Regional will receive notification that the credentialing questions were the result of an erroneous federal record, not any action on your part. That doesn't undo 2 years of... No, Trent said. It doesn't. They stood in the motel room with the bent window lock and the loud heater and the absence of what was supposed to have happened here. There's one more thing, Trent said. What? The third operator, the rifle shooter from Route 9. She looked at Mara carefully. He came across the border from Wyoming 3 hours ago. We have him on highway cameras. She paused. He's not heading north. He's heading east. Washington, Mara said. That's the working assumption. Trent's voice was measured, but something underneath it was not. If Crane has determined that his ground-level operations are compromised and that the IG net is closing, his last viable move is to remove the investigation itself. Not the witness. The investigators. Mara looked at her. Hatch is on a plane to Washington in 40 minutes, Trent said. The IG lead is being notified. But the session tomorrow morning, the room, the people in it, she paused. Crane doesn't know the full scope of who's going to be in that room. He knows about the IG. He doesn't know about you. The sentence sat there. He doesn't know I'm going to be there, Mara said. No one outside this hallway knows you're going to be there, Trent said, because as of an hour ago, I arranged for you to be there. She looked at Mara steadily. Your sworn statement is in the sealed package. But a statement on paper is one thing. You, In that room, walking them through the intercept in your own voice, answering questions that a sealed document can't answer, is something Crane can't prepare for, Mara said. Yes, Trent paused. If you're willing. The heater ran loud. The parking lot light threw a flat orange rectangle through the window onto the floor between them. Mara thought about the room she was being described, the closed session, the sealed evidence package, the man who'd reached into her career and closed his hand around it without ever being in the same room as her, the man who'd paid for witnesses to be killed with the particular administrative remove of someone who thought of people as case files. She thought about what it would mean to walk into that room tomorrow. Not as a nurse on administrative leave, not as a discharged soldier with a compressed record, as herself, fully, with the whole weight of what she'd done and what had been done to her present in the same space as the person responsible. Yes, she said. I'm willing. Trent nodded. Then she said more quietly, there's one variable we can't control. The shooter. He has a 12-hour head start, and we don't have eyes on him right now. If he reaches Washington before we do, if Crane's had him briefed on who's going to be in that room, she stopped. You should know the risk is real. Mara looked at the bent window lock. I've known the risk was real since the diner, she said. She picked up her bag. Then Hatch appeared in the doorway, coat on, phone in hand, moving with the specific velocity of someone whose timeline had just compressed. And the look on his face was not quite alarm, and not quite something else. But whatever it was not good. We have a problem, he said. He turned the phone screen toward them. A news alert, time-stamped 11 minutes ago from a Washington political outlet. The headline read, Senate Oversight Chair Crane calls emergency press conference, alleges federal investigators targeting political opponents. He'd found out, and he'd moved first. Hatch read the headline a second time as if it might change. It didn't. Crane's press conference was already live on 2 cable feeds. Trent pulled it up on her phone, and they stood in the motel room watching a man in a dark suit stand behind a podium in a federal building lobby in Washington and speak with the particular measured outrage of someone who'd spent decades learning how to perform innocence at scale. He talked about overreach. He talked about politically motivated investigations targeting public servants who asked difficult questions of the intelligence community. He used the word weaponized twice in 4 minutes, and he looked directly into the camera when he said it, and he was good at it. Good enough that if you didn't know what was in the sealed package, if you hadn't read The Intercept or sat across from Garrett Novak in a stopped federal vehicle or watched a man in wrong shade scrubs reach for an IV line, you might believe him. That was the calculation. He wasn't trying to win the legal fight tonight. He was trying to win the public frame before the legal fight started, seeding enough ambiguity into the next 12 hours that whatever came out of the closed session tomorrow morning would land in a media environment already primed to read it as contested rather than conclusive. It was smart. She gave him that. He's trying to get ahead of the documentation, she said. Yes, Hatch said. Does it work? Hatch looked at his phone. Depends on how fast we move and whether what we put in front of the session tomorrow can cut through 14 minutes of primetime framing. He already had his coat fully on. I have to go. My flight is in 38 minutes. I'll be on the morning flight, Mara said. He looked at her. A quick, assessing look that she'd gotten used to from him, the kind that was never quite finished. You understand that once you walk into that building tomorrow, your name is going to be on record, publicly, eventually. This won't stay sealed. I know. The press conference changes the environment. Crane has now made himself a public figure in this fight, which means anyone associated with the investigation becomes a public figure by proximity. Hatch. She looked at him steadily. I know. Go catch your flight. He went. She didn't sleep. She sat in the chair by the desk with the bent lock window behind her and the heater running its noise, and she thought about nothing in particular, which was different from not thinking. She'd learned the distinction in the field, the deliberate emptying that wasn't rest, but was the closest available substitute. By 4 a.m, she was clear in the specific way of someone who'd moved past tired into something more functional. Trent arranged the flight, a 6:45 out of Garrison's small regional airfield, connection in Denver, Washington by noon. Mara packed what she had, which wasn't much. The trauma pack stayed, no use for it where she was going, and the thought of carrying a field kit into a Senate building had a particular absurdity she was willing to sit with. On the plane, she looked out at the Mountain West going flat into the distance below and thought about the diner. The blood on the floor, the glass, the 19 minutes of a turkey melt she'd never touched. The specific quality of Novak's eyes when he'd looked at her from the floor, the assessment, the decision being made. She'd been annoyed at him for it, she realized, for the first time now that she had enough distance to be annoyed. He'd used her situation, the smallness of it, the careful life she'd built, as an operational variable. He'd dropped a bleeding man through a plate glass window into her evening and let the rest follow from that. She was also aware that without it, Philip Crane would still be sitting on his subcommittee while the third node of a criminal network continued to do what criminal networks do. Both things were true simultaneously. She filed them under the general category of how operations actually work, which was not cleanly and not without cost, and turned her attention to the window. Talk. The closed session was held in a building 3 blocks from the Capitol, in a room that was smaller than she'd imagined. A conference room, essentially, with a long table and institutional carpeting and the fluorescent overhead lights that apparently came standard in every government building, regardless of the significance of what happened inside them. When Crane walked in at 9:04, he saw the IG lead, 2 DOJ attorneys, Hatch and Trent. He took that in, recalibrated visibly, and began a sentence about the irregular composition of the meeting. Then he saw Mara. The sentence stopped. She watched him understand. Not all of it, not immediately, but enough. The shape of it. The fact that there was someone in this room he hadn't accounted for, which meant his model of the situation was incomplete, which meant the press conference last night had been built on a foundation that was now, in this room, visibly cracked. He sat down. His attorney sat beside him. The IG lead opened the session. What followed was 4 hours and 20 minutes of the most consequential conversation Mara had ever been in, and also, in some ways, the most tedious. Federal proceedings had a texture that narrative didn't capture. The repetition, the procedural confirmations, the careful legal architecture that had to be built before anything structural could happen. She answered questions for 2 of those hours. She walked them through the intercept, the phrasing, the chain of reports, the shutdown, the 3 years of compressed record, and what it had cost her to function professionally inside a system that had quietly stripped her ability to verify herself. She said it without drama. She said it the way she wrote nursing notes, functional, precise, with nothing performing anything except the facts. She had learned in a different context that the facts, given room, were sufficient. They did not need to be dressed up. They needed to be accurate, and they needed to be sourced, and they needed to be said by someone who was present and willing to be present without flinching, and she could do all of those things. Crane's attorney objected twice. Both objections were noted, and both were overruled by the IG lead with a brevity that suggested he'd expected them. Crane himself said very little. That was the tell she watched for. Not his denials, which came through his attorney, but the increasing quality of his silence. Men like Crane, in her experience, filled silence with institutional authority. When they stopped filling it, something had changed in their assessment of the room. By the 3rd hour, his assessment of the room was clearly that he'd lost it. The intercept archive was entered into the record. The medical officer's testimony was read into the record. Novak's operational documentation. He was participating remotely, voice only, from a hospital bed in Garrison with a surgeon's sign-off that he was cognitively functional, even if his shoulder disagreed, was entered into the record. The 3rd operator had been apprehended at Dulles Airport at 7:15 that morning, carrying documentation that connected him to the Vector network and, through that connection, to a payment structure that traced to a shell account Crane's chief of staff had been managing for 6 years. That was the piece that ended it. Not cleanly, nothing legal ended cleanly, but definitively. The chief of staff had been in federal custody since 6 that morning and had provided, through his attorney, a preliminary cooperation agreement that named names and structures and transactions with the specific thoroughness of someone who understood that the ship was going down and wanted to be on the right side of the waterline. When the session closed, Crane's attorney requested a recess to confer with his client. The recess lasted 11 minutes. When they came back, the attorney announced that his client was prepared to cooperate with the investigation in full. Mara watched Crane's face when his attorney said it. He was looking at the table, and his expression was not what she'd expected. Not fear, not defiance. Something more hollowed than either of those. The look of a man confronting the arithmetic of a situation he'd miscalculated for long enough that the miscalculation had become structural. She didn't feel satisfied by it, exactly. She'd expected to feel something cleaner and found instead something more complicated. The recognition that the person who'd shaped 3 years of her life with a single administrative decision was not a monster in the cinematic sense, but a specific human being who'd made specific choices for reasons that were probably, at their origin, comprehensible, even if the results were not. That didn't make it right. It just made it true. She looked away from him and looked at the institutional carpeting and let the moment be what it was. The formal outcomes moved faster than she'd expected, which Trent later told her was because the cooperation agreement unlocked documentation that had been sitting in a sealed DoD archive for 4 years, and once that documentation was accessible, the evidentiary picture became less a matter of argument and more a matter of processing. Crane resigned his Senate seat 11 days after the closed session. The announcement was released on a Thursday afternoon, buried under other news the way these things always were. A brief statement about health considerations that nobody believed and nobody needed to believe. 3 of his staff members were indicted. The chief of staff entered a formal plea agreement. The Vector Network's remaining operational infrastructure was dismantled over the following 6 weeks by a joint federal task force, and the 2 contractors in federal custody from Harlow and Route 9 were charged under statutes that carried mandatory minimums long enough to make cooperation the only rational option. The man from room 412, the one whose wrist she'd broken, cooperated first. He gave them the full operational chain in exchange for a reduced sentence, and the documentation he provided corroborated everything in the sealed package and added 6 additional contract arrangements that broadened the criminal case significantly. Mara's service record was restored in full. The compression was reversed, the operational documentation reattached, and her discharge was reclassified with language that accurately reflected what she'd done and what had been done to her. She received a letter from the Department of the Army that was 2 paragraphs long and used very careful language and did not constitute an apology but was as close to one as the institution knew how to get. She folded it and put it with the piece of paper she carried, not instead of it, alongside it. Harlow Regional Medical Center received a notification from the Federal Credentialing Office that the irregularities in Nurse Mara Voss's employment record had been the result of an administrative error originating in a federal database, and that her credentials were confirmed valid and unencumbered. Linda Hosch called her personally to convey the information and to offer reinstatement. She thanked Hosch and told her she needed some time to decide. Novak was released from the Garrison Hospital after 16 days. He called her on a Wednesday morning when she was sitting in the apartment above the dry cleaner, which she'd kept, because leaving it felt like letting one more thing be decided for her, and she was done with that. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You owe me a better one than the operation I got," she said. There was a pause. "That's fair." "You chose Harlow because of me." "Yes." "You could have surfaced in Billings. You could have surfaced anywhere in the Mountain West with a federal facility." She looked at the view of the dry cleaner's sign, the mountains beyond it. "You came here because you needed to know whether I was still operational." "I came here," he said, "because you were the only person connected to the original investigation who hadn't been bought, scared off, or compromised. And because Colonel Trent told me that if I needed someone I could trust in a genuinely bad situation, there was a name." A pause. She was right. She sat with that. "What happens to you now?" she said. "Recovery, then reassignment." He paused. "And you?" She looked at the apartment, the ring mark on the table, the kitchen she'd stalked slowly, the floor that had been a reasonable substitute for a bed on too many nights. "I haven't decided yet," she said. "There's a standing offer," he said, "from the Joint Task Force. Training and advisory, specifically combat medical protocols for operational units. The kind of institutional knowledge that doesn't get documented because the people who have it don't usually stay in the system long enough to pass it on." Another pause. "They asked me to mention it." "Just mention it." "Just mention it." She almost said no. The reflex was there. The same reflex that had brought her to Harlow in the first place, the pull toward smallness and quiet, and the management of a life in a register that didn't require her to be all of what she actually was. But that reflex had always been about safety and never about want, and she was tired of mistaking one for the other. "Tell them I'll think about it," she said. There was something in the pause that followed that she interpreted, given everything, as a smile. "I'll tell them," he said. 3 weeks later, on a cold, clear Montana morning, she drove out to the Copper Kettle Diner. It had been open again for weeks. The ownership had replaced the pastry case and the linoleum section nearest the door. And if you didn't know to look for the seam in the floor, you wouldn't see it. She ordered the turkey melt she'd never finished. She ate it this time. The waitress who brought the coffee was not the same one who'd been working that night. The busboy who'd stared at her hands was not there. The particular night that had started, everything had been absorbed into the ordinary life of the place, which was how it should be. She thought about what it meant to carry something for a long time without knowing its full weight. She'd done it for 3 years. The compressed record, the small life, the careful management of everything. She was in rooms that couldn't hold it. She'd thought she was surviving. She'd been surviving. But there was a difference between enduring a situation and understanding it, and she hadn't fully understood it until a man had come through a door bleeding and she'd moved toward him instead of away. The things she'd learned, not in the diner, not in the hospital, but in the accumulated experience of the weeks that followed, was that the people who underestimated her had never been the real problem. The real problem was the moments when she'd helped them do it, when she'd made herself smaller to fit the space they were offering her, when she'd kept her hands clean and her history quiet and her full self at a distance from anything that might require explaining. You didn't survive something by shrinking away from it. You survived it by remaining, as completely as possible, the person you were before the thing tried to change you. And then you kept going, which was the part nobody made a ceremony of, because it happened quietly and every day and without an audience. She'd been a soldier and a medic and an operator and a nurse, and none of those things had canceled the others out. All of it was hers. All of it was her. She paid for the meal and left a good tip and walked out into the cold morning. Garrett Novak had survived. Philip Crane was facing a federal proceeding that would occupy the rest of his professional life. The third operator was in custody. The network that had reached into her career and closed its hand was, piece by piece, being taken apart by people with the authority and the evidence to dismantle it properly. And she was standing outside a diner in Harlow, Montana, on a clear, cold morning with her whole record intact and her full name attached to it, and the mountains to the west doing what Montana mountains always did, which was stand there and be completely indifferent to whatever humans were working out at their feet. She'd spent 3 years being the nurse everyone underestimated. She was done being underestimated, not because she'd proven something to anyone else. That had never been the point, and making it the point was a trap she'd watched other people fall into, but because the version of herself that fit in that box had always been too small, and she was finished tolerating the discomfort of it. She got in her car. She had a call to return and a decision to make, and exactly enough left in her to make it. That was enough. It had always been enough. She drove north into the morning.